The axe split the frozen log clean through, and Eliza Brennan watched from the cabin doorway as the silent man worked. 3 weeks ago, she'd had nothing, no food, no firewood, no hope. Now steam rose from a pot of venison stew, and her children slept warm for the first time since their father died. She didn't know his name. He'd never spoken a single word. But when he looked at her across the fire each night, she saw something that terrified her more than poverty ever had. She saw a future. 6 weeks earlier, the November wind cut through Eliza's threadbare shawl as she stood outside the company store in Timber Ridge, Montana Territory. Inside, Mr. Holcomb shook his head for the third time. "I can't extend more credit, Mrs. Brennan. Your husband's account is 4 months past due. The mine paid out his final wages after the accident. There's nothing left." Eliza's throat tightened. Behind her, 7-year-old Samuel held his sister's hands, 5-year-old Anna, and 3-year-old Ruth. All three stared at her with hollow eyes that had grown too familiar with hunger. "Just flour and beans, Mr. Holcomb. Please. The children. I got children of my own to feed." He turned back to his ledger. "You'll need to sort this with the company. We're fine work." Outside, snow had begun to fall. Eliza pulled the children close as they walked the mile back to the cabin her husband had built before the mine ceiling took him. No work existed for widows in Timber Ridge except the kind that would destroy what little remained of her soul. The cabin was dark and cold. Thomas had cut enough firewood for October, planning to stockpile more before the deep cold came. But Thomas was 6 feet under frozen ground now, and Eliza had no axe, no saw, no knowledge of how to fell timber even if she had the strength. She lit their last candle and counted what remained: 2 cups of cornmeal, a handful of dried beans, half a jar of lard. 3 days of food, maybe 4 if she gave the children her portions. "Mama, I'm hungry." Ruth's small voice cracked something inside Eliza's chest. "I know, baby. We'll eat soon." She mixed the cornmeal with water and fried small cakes in the lard. The children ate in silence. Samuel, too young to carry a man's burden but old enough to understand, watched her with his father's serious eyes. "You didn't eat, Mama." "I'm not hungry tonight." The lie sat bitter on her tongue. That night, after the children slept huddled together under every blanket they owned, Eliza stood at the window watching snow pile against the woodshed. The mercury had dropped. By morning, frost would coat the inside of the walls. She thought about walking into Timber Ridge, about knocking on doors, begging. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. But she knew these people. The mining families had nothing to spare, and the company men would offer help that came with prices she wouldn't pay. Sleep came fitfully, and she woke to Ruth's coughing, the deep, rattling kind that meant her lungs were filling with cold. The next 2 days blurred into a desperate routine. Eliza burned the last of Thomas's carpentry scraps to keep the stove alive. She walked to the creek and broke ice to fill their water bucket. She made soup from the beans, stretching it thinner each meal. On the 3rd morning, she woke to silence. The fire had died completely. Her breath clouded the air inside the cabin. The children lay so still she had to watch their chests to be sure they were breathing. Eliza walked outside into knee-deep snow. The woodshed stood 30 yards away, and beyond it, the forest pressed close, thick pine and spruce that mocked her with abundance she couldn't touch. She tried to break branches from the dead tree near the shed. Her hands, raw and cracked, bled against the frozen bark. The branches wouldn't snap. She yanked harder, sobbing with frustration and fear, until her vision blurred and her knees buckled. That's when she saw him. He stood at the tree line, massive and still as the mountains themselves. Easily 6.5 feet tall, shoulders broad as an ox yoke, bare-chested despite the cold. His chest and arms were carved from labor and survival. Thick muscle, old scars, skin that had seen every season the high country could throw at a man. Dark hair fell past his shoulders, and a heavy beard covered half his face. He wore canvas trousers and fur-lined boots, and he carried an axe that looked like an extension of his arm. Eliza froze. Stories filled every mining camp about men who lived alone in the deep timber. Men who'd gone feral, who'd killed, who'd fled civilization for reasons decent people didn't ask about. He studied her with eyes the color of winter sky, taking in her bleeding hands, her collapsed posture, the silent desperation written across every line of her body. Then he walked past her to the woodshed, selected a log, and split it with one strike. He split another, and another. He worked with mechanical efficiency, his breath steaming, the muscles of his back and shoulders flexing under skin that showed the map of a hard life. Eliza found her voice. "I can't pay you." He didn't acknowledge her. He just kept splitting wood. When he'd created a pile as tall as her waist, he gathered an armload and walked to her cabin. He pushed the door open with his boot and fed the stove, building the fire with practiced hands. The children stirred as warmth began to seep back into the room. Samuel sat up, eyes wide at the giant stranger kneeling by their stove. The man stood, looked at Eliza once more, then walked back outside. He split wood until the shed overflowed, until enough fuel stood stacked to last a month. Then he disappeared into the forest as silently as he'd come. He came back at dawn with a deer across his shoulders. Eliza woke to the sound of his knife working outside, the clean scrape of blade against hide. She wrapped her shawl tight and stepped onto the porch. He'd hung the carcass from the shed beam and was skinning it with the precision of a man who'd done this 1,000 times. His hands moved steadily, separating hide from meat, and steam rose from the warm carcass into frozen air. "Sir." Her voice sounded small against the mountain silence. "I don't understand. Why are you helping us?" He glanced at her, then back to his work. No words, no explanation, just the continued rhythm of survival made manifest. By the time the children woke, he'd quartered the deer and carried the meat inside, laying it on her table wrapped in clean cloth. Eliza stared at more food than she'd seen in months. Her eyes burned. "Thank you," she whispered. I can't." He was already walking back outside. She watched through the window as he surveyed the property, taking in the sagging porch rail, the broken shutter, the well cover that had cracked in the freeze. He retrieved tools from a pack she hadn't noticed and went to work. For 3 days, he moved through her world like weather, inevitable, unspoken, transformative. He repaired what Thomas's death had left broken. He cut timber from the forest, hauling logs that should have required 2 men and a mule. He reinforced the cabin's north wall where wind had worked between the chinking. He fixed the roof where snow had begun to seep through. The children watched him with mixed wonder and fear. Ruth hid behind Eliza's skirts. Anna stared openly. But Samuel followed at a distance, studying how the man worked, how he moved, what tools he used and why. On the 4th day, Samuel approached him at the woodpile. "Can you teach me?" The man looked down at the boy, then handed him a small hatchet. He showed Samuel how to position kindling, where to strike, how to let the tool's weight do the work. No words passed between them, but Samuel's face blazed with concentration. Eliza watched from the cabin, something tight in her chest loosening for the first time since Thomas died. Her son needed this. Needed a man who didn't see him as a burden or a reminder of debts unpaid. Needed someone to show him how to be strong in a world that would demand strength. That evening, as Eliza ladled venison stew into bowls, she set a 4th portion on the table. The man had been eating alone outside by his fire. He hesitated in the doorway when she gestured him in. This massive, scarred stranger who'd asked nothing and given everything. "Please," she said. "We have plenty because of you." He stepped inside, ducking under the frame. He sat on Thomas's chair, the only one that could bear his weight, and ate slowly, carefully, like a man who'd forgotten what it was to share a table. The children snuck glances at him. Anna's curiosity finally broke through her shyness. "What's your name, mister?" He looked at her, something softening in his fierce expression. But he said nothing, just returned to his meal. "Doesn't he talk, Mama?" Anna whispered. "Some people don't need words, sweetheart. They speak with what they do." After supper, the man rose and moved toward the door. Eliza followed him onto the porch. Stars burned cold and bright above the mountains. "Are you leaving?" She didn't mean for her voice to crack with panic, but it did. He looked at her fully then, and she saw things in his face she hadn't noticed before. Not just strength, but loneliness. Not just survival, but isolation. This man knew mountains and timber and the kind of silence that could drive a person mad. He knew cold and hunger and what it cost to endure. He shook his head slowly. "Not leaving." Relief flooded through her, so completely her knees weakened. He caught her elbow, steadying her with a touch that was gentle despite his calloused palm and massive hands. The heat of his skin burned through her thin sleeve. "I should know what to call you," she said softly. He held her gaze, and in the firelight spilling from the cabin window, She saw his throat work, the effort of a man who had lived so long without speech that words had become foreign. Cade. His voice came rough and low, scraping up from disuse. Just the one word, but it cost him something to give it. Cade, she repeated. I'm Eliza, and you've saved our lives. His jaw tightened. He didn't want gratitude. Didn't know what to do with her standing close in the starlight, looking at him like he was something other than the monster the mountains had made him. Over the following weeks, a rhythm developed. Cade worked from first light until dark, cutting timber, improving the property, hunting game. He built a smokehouse and filled it with meat. He reinforced the barn Thomas had started and never finished. He dug a second wall closer to the cabin. Eliza cooked and mended and kept the children warm. She watched Cade teach Samuel to set snares, to read animal tracks, to understand weather signs in the sky. She saw Ruth lose her fear and start leaving small treasures, pretty rocks, pine cones, on the porch rail for him. She noticed Anna chattering to him endlessly, unbothered that he rarely answered, content with his quiet presence. And she felt the weight of his gaze when he thought she wasn't looking. Felt the careful distance he maintained, never coming too close, never presuming. He slept in the barn he'd weatherproofed, despite her offering him space inside. He was protecting more than their lives. He was protecting her reputation, her dignity, her right to choose. In early December, 3 riders came up the mountain pass. Eliza was hanging laundry when she saw them. Company men from Timber Ridge, recognizable by their mashed horses and clean coats. Her stomach dropped. Samuel, take your sisters inside. The boy obeyed instantly, fear sharpening his features. He'd learned to read danger. The riders stopped in front of the cabin. The lead man was Mr. Vernon, the mine superintendent. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Mrs. Brennan, you've been missed in town. We've been managing fine up here. So I see. Vernon's gaze swept the property, the stacked firewood, the repaired buildings, the smoke rising from the chimney. Question is how? Your husband left debts. This land belongs to the mining company now, used to house our workers. We've been patient, but it's time you moved along. This is my home. These are my children's home. Not according to the deed. Thomas never filed the claim properly. Vernon pulled papers from his coat. We're willing to be generous. There's a boarding house in town that needs a cook and cleaning woman. Room and board, small wage. Better than starving up here. Eliza knew what that offer meant. The boarding house catered to unmarried minors. She'd be available for more than cooking, whether she agreed or not. We're not leaving. Vernon's expression hardened. You don't have a choice, Mrs. Yes, she does. Cade emerged from the tree line, carrying timber across his shoulders. He dropped the logs and walked forward, and the horses shied nervously at his approach. In the winter sunlight, he looked carved from the mountain itself. Massive, immovable, dangerous. Vernon's hand dropped to the pistol on his belt. Who the hell are you? Cade stopped beside Eliza, close enough that she felt the heat radiating off him despite the cold. He looked at Vernon with eyes that had seen men like him before. Men who used power to take what they wanted from the defenseless. Her husband. Cade's voice came rough, but clear. Leave. Vernon laughed, sharp and ugly. That's convenient. Where were you when Thomas Brennan died? Where were you when she was begging credit at the store? Here now? Cade's hand rested on the axe at his belt. Not threatening, just present. Just a fact. Leave. The 2 riders behind Vernon shifted nervously. This wasn't what they'd signed on for. One whispered something Eliza couldn't hear, and Vernon's face flushed red. This isn't over. The company owns this land, and no vagrant mountain man is going to check the deed again. Eliza's voice cut through his bluster. The claim is filed. In my name. My maiden name. Thomas filed it the day we married, before he took work at the mine. It's recorded in Helena. She was gambling. She found the deed papers in Thomas's trunk, but had never confirmed their validity. But something in Vernon's expression shifted, uncertainty creeping into his bravado. Even so, you can't work this land alone. Come spring, we'll be back. She's not alone. Cade's voice carried a finality that made the horses dance. Won't be alone. Ever. Vernon stared at them both. At Eliza standing straight despite her worn dress and rough hands. And at Cade radiating the kind of quiet menace that couldn't be bought or intimidated. Finally, he yanked his reins and turned his horse. You're making a mistake, Mrs. Brennan. They watched the riders disappear down the pass. When they were gone, Eliza's legs buckled. Cade caught her, his arms solid as oak timber, and she sagged against his chest. Her fingers clutched his shirt, and she felt his heart pounding, not from fear, but from rage held carefully in check. "I'm sorry," she gasped. "I shouldn't have. You didn't sign on for. Meant it." His arms tightened around her. Not alone. She pulled back enough to see his face. His eyes were fierce with something that made her breath catch. "Cade, you don't have to stay. You don't owe us. Not about owing." He cupped her face with hands that could split logs, but touched her like she was something precious. "About wanting. Want to stay. Want to." He struggled for words he'd stopped using years ago. "Want you. Want them. Want this." Tears spilled down Eliza's cheeks. "You don't know anything about me. About what I was before Thomas. About know enough. Know you're strong. Know you fight for your children. Know you don't quit." His thumb brushed away her tears. "Know I was dead inside before I saw you at that woodpile. Know I'm alive now." She rose on her toes and kissed him, tasting wood smoke and mountain air and the promise of a man who had found his way back to humanity through the simple act of caring for someone who needed him. The cabin door burst open and Samuel stood there, Anna and Ruth peering around him. "Are the bad men gone?" "They're gone, baby." Eliza didn't step away from Cade, and he didn't let her go. "They're gone, and they're not coming back." "Because Cade's here?" Anna asked hopefully. "Because Cade's here," Eliza confirmed, looking up at the man who'd built her a life from nothing. "And he's staying." 3 years later, the cabin had become a homestead. Cade had built an addition that gave the children their own room and added a real bedroom for him and Eliza. The barn housed 3 cows, a dozen chickens, and the mule he'd traded furs for. The vegetable garden stretched wide, and the smokehouse stayed full. Samuel, now 10, could fell a tree and work a trapline. Anna helped her mother with the younger ones, Ruth and the twins, Jacob and Rose, who'd been born the previous spring. The homestead thrived not through luck, but through relentless work and partnership. In Timber Ridge, people whispered about the widow who'd married the silent mountain man. Some called it scandalous. Others saw it for what it was, 2 people who'd saved each other when the world had given up on them both. On a summer evening, Eliza sat on the porch watching Cade teach Samuel to notch logs for the new shed they were building. Her hand rested on her swollen belly. Another child coming before winter. Cade looked up and caught her watching. The smile that crossed his scarred face still came rarely, but when it did, it transformed him completely. He'd told her his story eventually. How he'd lost his family to fever, how grief had driven him into the mountains, how years of isolation had stripped away his words until he'd forgotten what it meant to be human. How seeing her that November morning, desperate and fighting and refusing to quit, had reminded him. "Mama, can I show Cade the rabbit I drew?" Anna appeared with her slate, covered in chalk sketches. "After supper, sweetheart, help me set the table." The children's laughter floated through open windows. The mountain stood eternal against the darkening sky. Cade walked toward her, and she saw in his eyes what she felt in her heart. Gratitude not for rescue, but for the harder gift of being chosen, of being seen, of being home. He sat beside her, his large hand covering hers, and they watched the sun set over the life they'd built together in the wild places where broken things came to heal.